Good evening. I'm Ron. I'm a grateful Christian follower. I'm in recovery from codependency and anger. I'd like to start with a prayer. Dear Father, I thank you for everyone you brought here tonight. I praise and thank you for your love and guidance in my life daily. I pray that this testimony is pleasing to you and brings hope and encouragement to others. I was born in Youngstown, Ohio on January 25th, 1958. My dad was an electrician. My mom was a traditional mom. Also living in Youngstown were my grandparents, my great-grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins from my mom's side of the family. My dad was the only child, and his parents lived a distance away in Lima, Ohio. When I was 1 year old, I was baptized in the church that my mother and my grandparents attended. Over the years, our family grew, and I became the oldest of four. I had two brothers and a sister. Sometime along the way, my parents purchased their first house in Howland, Ohio. My father made a good living, and we had what we needed. We were surrounded by family and enjoyed family get-togethers and playing with our cousins. As I grew, though, I began to notice that what we needed in our life was not always happy. I was about 7 years old when I began to realize that my dad had a drinking problem. He was moody and had a mean temper. My parents would fight a lot. Their arguing was loud and consisted of screaming and yelling. My dad was very strict, easily upset, and would often spank for punishment. From a very young age, my mom would justify his behavior by saying, "Your dad just had a bad day, it'll be all right." Dad's drinking progressed, and his routine on most days was to go straight to the bar after work and come home drunk. On the weekends, my dad would take me to the bars. He would drink, and he'd feed me quarters to play games. That was the way that I spent time with my father. As I grew, the spankings intensified and became more like beatings. My mother would try to protect us and stop my dad, but it usually wound up that when he was done beating on me, my mom would be next. My brother and I would get the brunt of my dad's anger for the smallest things. I remember once when I was 7, I forgot to take the trash out. Dad came home drunk from the bar late, about 10 or 11, as he usually did. My forgetting to take out the trash angered him. He came into my bedroom, woke me up, proceeded to kick me all the way down the steps, out to the curb, back up the driveway, and back to my bedroom. When we got to the bedroom, he noticed my shoes weren't put away. I got a beating for that one, too. My dad just wasn't an alcoholic. He was a mean drunk. But only at home. He was very good at being on his best behavior when he needed to be. Everyone outside the immediate family thought my dad was the best. Ashamed and afraid, my mom hid my dad's behavior from the rest of the family and friends. Because she did not work and could not support our family on her own, she felt that she had nowhere to go. Needless to say, the vicious cycle went on for years, and Mom did the best she could to protect us. That's when I started building walls to protect myself. Since my younger brother and sister were so small, it was me, my brother David, who was 2 years younger than me, and my mom, who were my dad's targets. Our way of coping was to do our best to stay out of Dad's way and to not make him mad. Mom, David, and I did all we could to make Dad happy so we could be happy. This is where I learned my codependency. Eventually, my mom made a decision to go back to school. She struggled with protecting us and caring for us and my dad while trying to earn a teaching degree. It wasn't easy, but it was her way of getting out of her abusive marriage and to provide for us kids. I was 12 years old when she graduated from school, and she finally told her parents about the many years of abuse that we had endured. We immediately left Ohio and moved to Florida to live with my grandparents. Although my dad made good money, he refused to pay child support. Mom never fought him for the support because she was just relieved not to have to deal with him anymore. Because she had 4 kids and on her own, Mom had to work 3 jobs just to make ends barely meet. We didn't see much of her, and I had lots of time on my hands. Once we moved to Florida, we didn't see much of Dad, and that was fine with me. I was happy to be free of him and his abuse. With free time on my hands as a teenager, that's when I started smoking, using drugs, and drinking alcohol. I never trusted anyone and always avoided conflict with others. I was always trying to please everyone so I would feel good about myself. As I turned to drugs and alcohol to conceal my pain, they began to play a bigger role in my life. I used most of my teenage years. During my high school years, my mom got married again and moved to El Paso. We moved with her, but unfortunately her second husband was also an alcoholic. I was rebellious, I did what I wanted to do, and I was a very angry young man. I spent time bouncing between living with my mom in Texas and living with my dad in Ohio. When I got angry at one of them, I'd move to live with the other. I would leave one high school, go to another high school, and then back again. I managed to graduate high school in Texas at 18 and moved back to Ohio. I lived on my own and I continued to use, but I worked and did what I needed to do to get by and take care of myself. Eventually, I met a girl, fell in love, and got married at 21. We moved to Florida and bought a condo. I continued to use until at 24 years old, I became a dad. Once my daughter was born, I limited myself to smoking pot and drinking. 6 years later, my son was born. During that time, we had moved into a home. I worked long, hard days to provide for my family, but I thought my life was good. All appeared to be good, except I was still smoking pot and drinking, and the codependency and anger I never dealt with from the beginning started to run wild. I never physically abused my family, but I was verbally and mentally abusive. Both my wife and I had baggage and issues, which caused our relationship to deteriorate. After 17 years of marriage, we divorced. Divorce crushed me and fueled even more anger. I partied hard to deal with all that I had felt. I worked, I paid my child support, I had my kids every other weekend, but I still smoked pot, even on the weekends that I had my kids. The whole time of my marriage and after my divorce, I thought I was hiding my drug use from my kids. Guess what? Kids aren't dumb. 5 years of partying passed, and one morning I found myself waking up on a beach. I had had enough, and that's when I decided to talk to God. I told him I was sick and tired and asked for his help to stop partying. I prayed that he would put a good woman in my life and that I would have peace and serenity. God answered my prayers 1 year later when I met Leanne, a Christian lady who became my soulmate. We dated. She met my children. I met hers. We began to have my 2 kids and her 2 kids together on the same weekends. Although her kids were years younger than mine, we all got along and we had great times together. Leanne got me to go to church with her and her children. This is where she introduced me to Christ. See, I knew of God, but I never had a personal relationship with my Savior. Leanne and I fell in love and we were married September 16th, 2000. Prior to our marriage, we participated in a typical marital class with a pastor where I learned that I was to be the spiritual leader of my home. I became more involved in our church and did my walk to Emmaus. My walk to Emmaus weekend didn't go that well at first. I was angry at my wife and blamed her for pushing me into the weekend. The team members could tell I was angry, but they were very patient with me. I walked out of every talk, and Pastor Ralph, who followed right behind me and would talk to me. Finally, on Saturday, I had a breakthrough. Pastor Ralph helped me realize that I wasn't mad at my wife. I was angry and uncomfortable because I was having to take a close look at my life, and I didn't like what I saw. After my Emmaus weekend, my relationship with Christ deepened. I started attending a men's Bible study and served in the Kairos prison ministry. Serving made me feel good about myself. Meanwhile, my kids started to have difficulties and turned to using drugs. My daughter used more recreationally, while my son was using more heavily. For some time, I suspected they were using, but I chose to be in denial. You know, there was more. Let's just say one of my kids, let's just say neither one of my kids were in a good place. My wife was concerned about it and would tell her that it was just a phase. See, Leanne had been previously married to an alcoholic. For several years, she had been involved in step programs, recovery programs, and was currently in the ladies' Bible study at our church. When I began to get deeply involved with my kids' issues, Leanne quickly realized that I was not involved in a healthy way. Leanne and I argued. We disagreed on how to handle difficulties with her kids and mine, but life kept coming. There were problems with Leanne's ex-husband in custody of the kids. My daughter got pregnant, my son got arrested, and Leanne got cancer. I was worried about our finances as we were trying to fix everything and everyone. I was back to trying to make everyone happy so I could be happy. I thought I had left all my baggage behind me, but here was my anger and codependency rearing its ugly head once again. My codependency with my son, my anger in my life became unmanageable. After 13 years of marriage, Leanne told me that she just couldn't continue to live with me like this anymore. I asked her to please give me a chance, and I promised to get help. That was 5 years ago when I walked through those doors of CR and sought help from the codependency and anger. I had been in a men's Bible study group for quite a few years, and the guy suggested I do a 12-step program. So I signed up. I started the very next year-long 12-step program. Went to all the classes. I was there, but I did not get a sponsor, and I did not work the program, and needless to say, I didn't get anything out of it. Around that time, our Bible study group had just completed our curriculum, and we were looking for something new to work on, and they decided, hey, let's do another 12-step program. And I thought to myself, great, I just finished a 12-step program, but I agreed to do another one. You see, most of the guys in my men's Bible study had been doing the 12-step program for years, and they could see that I did not work my program. We started the program together, and this time I decided to get a sponsor and really work the program like I should have the first time. Step one, I admitted I was powerless over my problems and that my life was unmanageable. And I was no longer in denial about being able to handle this myself since nothing had changed the first time. Steps 2 and 3. After 56 years of trying to fix myself, I readily admitted that only a power greater than myself could restore my sanity and truly turn my will and my life over to God's care. Step 4 is where I put on the brakes in my last step study because I really didn't want to take a close look at myself. This time my sponsor helped encourage me to dig deep. In searching, once I truly honest with myself, I found pride issues, codependency issues, fear, anger, and resentments. I also became aware of how I treated those I loved, and that meant the most to me. Treated the ones I loved that meant the most to me. I was never physically abusive like my father, but I was definitely mental and verbally abusive. In addition, I learned that I did not know how to handle being hurt without hurting others. When I was growing up, my family just blew up at each other, shouted, vented at each other, and then we went our separate ways. That's how we were taught to handle uncomfortable emotions such as fear, hurt, and anger. I didn't know any better at the time, but in my inventory, I came to realize that what I learned about handling my emotions as a child was not right. As a child, I also learned to become a caregiver. I felt responsible for protecting my mom and my brother. I tried with my actions to control the actions of others. Being a caregiver led me to my career as a firefighter, where I could help others and was expected to do so. However, being able to help others successfully in my career justified my unhealthy caregiving, which led to my deep codependency with my son. My lack of ability to help him in his addictions made me upset and emotional. I would handle these emotions the way that I was taught as a child, by venting and taking my anger and frustration out on those who were closest to me. I would use any unrelated conflict as an opportunity to vent pent-up frustration and anger, and therefore rid myself of the emotions I couldn't handle. I learned that my desire to fix my son's problem, to make him happy, and to try to control the circumstances in order to control his addiction was detrimental to both of us and my relationship with my family. Step 5, because I had done my inventory, I was generally able to admit to God, my sponsor, and to myself the exact natures of my wrongs. At that point, I felt a tremendous weight lifted from me. 6 and 7, I was ready to have God remove these defect characters in me. One huge character defect for me was continually trying to make life work on my own power. Like I said before, I tried to do it my way for 56 years and it didn't work. I humbly asked God to remove all my shortcomings. 8 and 9, I made a list of all the persons I had harmed and became willing to make amends to them. I have completed most of my amends to such persons where possible, and although it isn't necessary, it's important to me to make my amends in person. 10, I've learned to take personal inventory every day, and when I'm wrong, promptly admit it. 11, every morning I read 3 or 4 devotionals and pray. This has been my daily routine for the past 4 years. And 12, I give back what I have found by serving, teaching a 12-step program, working a 12-step program with a sponsee, and facilitate an anger codependency class here at CR. As of today, 5 years later, I have completed 4 12-step programs. Each time, God has never failed to put something on my plate. I steadily worked on my codependency issues with my son. It took some time to really understand that the choice of recovery belonged to my son and that only God could help him. Eventually, God gave me the courage to put my son in his hands. That was about 3.5 years ago. I still love my son, but I knew that he had to suffer the consequences and decisions of his addictions. My wife and I prayed constantly for Matt. We asked God to help him out in his addictions, to protect him, and to keep him from harming others if he chose to drive intoxicated. We asked that God would put someone in his life to bring him to Christ. Now you should know, Matthew attended church with Leanne and I on his weekends with us, but he resisted any notion of believing in God and eventually resisted even going to church at all with us. Matthew died a little over a year ago, November 14th, 2017. He was in a car accident. He was in his truck, but he was a passenger and someone else was driving. He was still feeding his addictions. Both he and the driver had been drinking heavily. The driver was speeding and lost control of the vehicle. The driver survived, Matthew did not. My wife told me that for 2 days after hearing that news, I just kept asking God to please take his soul. Because I knew Matthew didn't believe in God, and this was a great concern to me. On the second day after his death, during my morning devotionals and prayer time, I felt everyone's prayers for me and God's grace. A huge rush of peace and serenity came over me, and God let me know that Matthew was with him. Around an hour later, while I was still in my devotional time, I received a phone call. The man on the other end of the phone was John, my son's boss in Colorado. I'd never met the man. He called to extend his sympathy and his condolences. He told me that he and his wife were Christians and that he knew Matthew's addictions and saw that he needed help. John went off and spoke to Matthew about God. Matthew would resist, saying, I don't believe in God. For months, John persisted and finally one day agreed to take home a devotional, The Daily Bread, and he read it. A day or two before the accident, Matt spoke with John about reading that devotional. He told his boss that it was the first time in his life that he understood and it all made sense to him. So for that moment, for that second, or for that day that he read that devotional and understood, I knew that Matthew met Jesus. God gave me the gift of peace and comfort in letting me know that Matthew was in his hands. Leanne and I came to realize that God had answered our prayers for Matthew. He put someone in Matthew's life who introduced him to Christ. No one else was harmed in the accident, and he was healed from all his addictions. Our prayers were answered. It just wasn't the way we thought it was going to be. Prior to walking through those doors 5 years ago, I was so addicted to my son and full of fear, emotion, and anger, I can't imagine how I would have dealt with Matthew's death. I could never have gotten through it without all I've learned, the friendships and the grace that God has given me through CR. You see, because of CR, I have tools to use to combat my old habits and hang-ups. When they decide to show up, I listen, and I'm aware of how my reactions and the tone of my voice can affect others. I'm much better in identifying my feelings and communicating them. Now, instead of trying to handle things on my own, I ask for help. Don't get me wrong. I still need my sponsor, my men's group, and my wife, Leanne, to hold me accountable. Life still goes on as it did before. It isn't always easy, and the world always tries to push me around, as I call it. But now I recognize my defects quicker, and I respond better. My wife, Leanne, still has me around, and last September we celebrated our 18th wedding anniversary. I can honestly say that I've changed, and today I am a much better man than I ever was. The best part about that is that my wife, my friends, and my family can see that change. I'm approachable, they believe in me, and they trust me not to hurt them. I am the spiritual leader of my household. My life is less stressful, calm, and more manageable. I personally know my Savior, and I know that He is faithful. Because of Him, I experience joy in good times and even the bad times. I'm happy and gratefully living and enjoy each and every day. And I'd like to close with Ephesians 2:8. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this from yourself, it is the gift of God. Thank you, Jesus.